Hey guys, it's Ed. I'm going to do another one of my rambles today. This is just background information for my campaign for Dungeons and Dragons. I use the basic and expert rules, which are a very old school set of rules going all the way back to the late 70s, early 80s. Um, but the whole world is quite different from your standard D&D campaign. And so let's talk about that. Last video I talked a little bit about Agleka, but I neglected to show off some of the art. And so as we go through more background information, I'm going to share up some of the art so you can see it. This is the holy symbol of Agleka, or her image. This was done by J.E. Shields, who's a fantastic artist. Shields did a whole bunch of icons, religious icons for me. I have them framed up around my little desk space here, as well as some wonderful kind of banner art for different areas for my Dragon's March campaign area. And I'm hoping maybe a little later this year to uh, High Shields to get together with him and have him do some more banners for me and some more pieces of art. But anyway, last video we talked a lot about Agleka, who was betrayed by her brother and sister gods among the elves, and was cursed and turned into this Gorgon-like figure, and went through all sorts of trials and tribulations, only to be dumped in mithril chains crafted by the dwarves for the men to bind her in, into this dormant volcano way up in the north, beyond the warholds of the Northmen, up in the Winter's Mark, which is sort of like the Arctic region of my world. So one thing we just briefly touched on last time, beyond Agleka, who is definitely an active villainess in my game, is the major villain, who is this guy Pazar Rune Sin. And Sin is a fellow now called the Wraith King. He comes from the Necrogarchy of Lang, which is this kingdom far off to the east. That kingdom is sort of modeled after ancient Persia. They have vast conquests even further to the east from where I have them on my map, and really they are the most eastern land portrayed on my map, although they control a lot of territory in sort of the world off of the official stage. The Necrogarchy of Lang has had its eyes on the kingdoms of the west for some time, and has been interested in flexing its muscles and conquering as much of the world as possible. The rulers of the Necrogarchy of Lang, as you might have guessed, are arcane magic users who use their magic to cast powerful necromantic spells to increase their life expectancy, and to ultimately turn them into an undead, sort of a lich form. Now, as these creatures age over hundreds of years, they sort of slow down and become more and more dormant, until finally they retire themselves into these vaults underneath their capital city of Piatum, which is this enormous capital for the Necrogarchy of Lang off in the east. It has a population of 100,000, which is just enormous for any city in my world. At any rate, so these necromasters retire themselves down under the city in these vaults, where they seat themselves in this huge hall with all these rows of thrones. And the people of the city, the captains of the towers who rule the city, when there is no necromaster currently on the throne above ground, can come down into the Undercity and kind of commune with them to get their instructions for future doings. So Pazar Rune Sin long ago was a captain of one of the three great towers of Piatum, and Piatum is a walled city divided into three parts, and each part has this um, huge, tall obsidian tower that controls all the traffic through that part of the city. And in each tower is sort of like the beating heart, one of three hearts of the empire of the Necrogarchy of Lang. And so being a captain of one of the three towers is a huge position within the Necrogarchy of Lang, second only to the Necromasters themselves. Now, typically, these captains are, one of them is selected to become the next Necromaster, but circumstances occurred where the Necromasters needed to launch an invasion into the west, and there's a lot of important secret plot stuff about that I don't really want to divulge here in case any of my players watch these videos. But so suffice to say that about 300 years ago, this guy, Pazar Rune Sin, a captain of one of the towers, was tapped on the shoulder to lead one of three massive armies of evil into the west, to invade the west and conquer as much land as possible. And he was tasked specifically with taking his army through the Goblin Spite Mountains to the northwest, gather as much evil with him as possible, and then march into the Warholds of the North, where the Northmen live, and conquer it and set up his own kind of sub-kingdom under the authority of the Necrogarchy of Lang, which he did. He captured the kingdoms of Osvik, Hrader, and Morgwin, which are petty kingdoms. Each of them has maybe a 60-mile west to east, 50-mile west to east territory, maybe another 50 miles north to south. So not really, really small kingdoms, but not anything like the size of the kingdoms that are considered the civilized kingdoms of the south. The king of Osvik back in those days might have been able to call 300 or 400 warriors to his banner in a time of emergency, versus the thousands that can be called by the kingdom of Daria, or the many thousands that can be called by the city-states of Carthusia in the lands of the south, the civilized lands of the south. So Pazar Rune Sin arrives, conquers these three kingdoms, and establishes his own kingdom of Asmorgar. Now, in the north, there are already two factions of pagan religion that have more or less coexisted. There were the Druids and the Corbi. Now, the Druids were the priests, basically, of the Northmen and the kings of the Warholds. The Corbi serve the four hags, which are what survives of the gods of the elves. When we talked about Aglaika in the previous video, we learned that Aglaika, without wanting to, turned her own father to stone. Her father was the god of elven magic, and by doing that, triggered the waning of elven magic and elven power in the entire world, to the point where the elven civilization collapsed. Elves were scattered throughout the world, and over many centuries have waned in their numbers, and in some cases been actively hunted down and killed, until there are nary but a very few left. I think in the kingdom of Osvik there are 2 elven NPCs hidden away in different corners of that entire kingdom, 50 miles by 50 miles. So that gives you some sense of just how rare they are. And elves are not readily available as a player character race. Now, you can choose to be an elf, but then you roll on this table to see If you're extremely lucky and you roll really well, you might actually even be a full-blooded elf. But it's a percentile roll, and I think it's 95% to double zeros is the only way you're a full-blooded elf. Everything else beyond that is a human-looking person with some elven blood in their ancestry, which plays into some of the plots with magic. But at any rate, Pazar Rune Sin conquers these kingdoms, and then he wants to gain some local support, and so he seduces with power a faction of the local druids. Now, the original druids in these lands were called the Ragged Cloak Druids, and let's see. You can see some of them here. They are acting as the bodyguards of Queen Gerrid Half Elven, who is the queen of the kingdom of Skierga to the east of Ostvik. And she's a current living character in the campaign as the daughter of an actual elf. She is very, very, very long-lived, and although she looks to be more of a woman in her late 30s to 40s, she's probably close to 400 or 500 years old, and has ruled the kingdom of Skierga most of that time. And we'll get back to her in a minute. But the Ragged Cloak Druids are the native priests of the Northmen. And they all are shape changers. They can change themselves into wolves or bears or falcons or different beasts more readily than they can cast magic. So their ability to shapeshift is, in my mind, kind of a connection of them to the wilderness, to the forests and mountains and hills, so that they are standing sort of on the cusp between the natural world, the animal world, and then the regular world of men. So where a old school D&D druid might at middle levels have a half dozen spells to maybe 10 spells depending on the system you're talking about, these fellows may have 3 or 4 spells that they can cast in a day, but they can change themselves into, you know, the equivalent of a werewolf or a wereboar or a werebear, which is quite powerful, I think you'll agree. But what Pazar Rune Sin did is he seduced with promises of power a faction of the druids. And by the way, this art is all done by my friend Marcin S., who is a Polish artist currently working in the UK. So he seduced a faction of the druids to give up their connection with nature in order to pursue supernatural powers and more magic that came directly from the stars. And they became the druids of the Henge and were responsible for building these giant stone monuments all scattered across the north. So the druids of the Henge and the Ragged Cloak Druids are eventually become enemies, you know, because the druids of the Henge are basically the devoted servants of Pazar Rune Sin, the king of the evil kingdom of Asmorgar. And over time, Pazar Rune Sin rules over the evil kingdom of Asmorgar for a little more than a century, and over that time he becomes known as the Wraith King, because he's got some undead powers and, you know, is from the Necrogarchy of Lang and that sort of thing. At any rate, I think I'll do a second video kind of from here. I'll post it up in a little while, but I have a limit of about 15 minutes for these videos, so I think I'm going to cut this one off now before I run out of time, and then we'll continue on. And thanks for watching. Talk to you soon.